Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Susie Gelman, and I'm privileged to serve as board chair of Israel Policy Forum. As always, if you're new to Israel Policy Forum, I want to welcome you. If you're not already receiving our updates and analysis by email, I hope you'll take this opportunity to sign up. Please be aware that we recently launched Israel Policy Hub, our new collection of digital resources, which you can find at israelpolicyforum.org/hub. Israel Policy Forum is committed to advancing a viable two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to ensure Israel's security and its Jewish and democratic future. In furtherance of our core mission, we've been raising the alarm about the threats posed by West Bank annexation for the past 3 years, educating American policymakers in Washington, American Jewish communal leaders, and emerging leaders of the next generation. Now it appears that annexation may be imminent. With the signing of a coalition agreement in Israel that calls for formal deliberations on annexation to begin July 1st, we must be especially vigilant. We're committed to continuing our work because of, not despite, the unprecedented global health crisis, which threatens to compound the consequences of annexation, about which we and our Israeli colleagues from Commanders for Israel's Security have long been raising the alarm. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Israel Policy Forum has ramped up our output. In March, we launched our Tuesday video briefing series. Our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, has doubled recordings and now publishes 2 episodes each week. Our growing Young Professionals Network, IPF ATID, continues to convene regular virtual gatherings. The Koplow column, published every Thursday by Policy Director Michael Koplow, remains a highly sought-after source of commentary and analysis on Israeli politics and the Jewish world. Through all these initiatives over the past 2 months, we reach thousands of people every week, including hundreds who are being introduced to our work for the first time. Last week's webinar, our largest yet since we entered this difficult new period, drew over 700 participants. But we depend on your generous support in order to keep going, and I would like to encourage you to make a contribution if you've not already done so, particularly at this moment, when Israel is poised to annex West Bank territory with the backing of the Trump administration. Your support is more important than ever. On this Giving Tuesday now, I encourage you to make a contribution to Israel Policy Forum at www.israelpolicyforum.org/giving. As we confront annexation, the attitudes of Israelis and Palestinians, the people who will clearly be most impacted by any annexation policy, is of critical importance. So today we're indeed fortunate to be joined by 2 renowned public opinion experts who will help us understand Israeli and Palestinian attitudes on this critical matter. Professor Gilad Hirschberger is an experimental social psychologist at the IDC in Herzliya. He recently conducted a major polling project for Commanders for Israel's Security. Professor Khalil Shikaki is the director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. He has carried out more than 200 polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza since 1993, along with dozens of joint Israeli-Palestinian polls. Gilad and Khalil, thank you so much for joining us. As always, we welcome your questions in today's discussion. If you're participating via the Zoom link, you can click on the Q&A tab to type out your questions. If you're joining by phone, please email your questions to info@ipforum.org, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible during the time we have today. Now I'd like to ask both Gilad and Khalil to share their opening remarks, starting with Gilad.
Thank you, Susie, and hello, everyone. I'm very happy and excited to be here, and I hope that you're all well during these times. I'm going to upload a PowerPoint presentation. One moment. And in the next few minutes, I will present a survey that I conducted along with my colleagues, with Dr. Sivan Hirschberger and with Professor Camille Fuchs on annexation and other issues that are related to policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So the research questions that guided the survey are, first of all, to understand Israeli public support for policy alternatives to see whether these change over time, to examine how relations with Jordan are related to support for policies. Maybe I'll have a little bit of time to talk about COVID-19 and its impact. And we will look at these questions, examining differences in political orientation and voting behavior. So in terms of the sample itself, the sample is an internet sample, a representative sample of Israelis using the Midgam platform of 1,009 participants. You can see here the breakdown by religion and by self-reported political identity. I won't go too much into these details. The first question that we'll look at is support for conflict-related policies. So what we have been doing in many of our surveys over the past couple of years mostly is asking Israeli participants to choose one out of 4 policy alternatives. Either support for a two-state solution, support for an Israeli-initiated separation from the West Bank, support for annexation of the West Bank, or continuation of the status quo. And as you can see here, 40% of the Israeli public support a two-state solution. An additional 22% support separation, which in a sense is a step towards a two-state solution. Only about a quarter of the Israeli public support annexation, and the remaining 13% support the status quo. If we look at that as a function of self-reported political identity, then we can see, of course, that the center and the left are supportive of a two-state solution, but even among right-wing Israelis, nearly 20% support a two-state solution. When we look at the separation alternative, there is no difference between the Israeli center and the right. Both of them, about a quarter, support separation, and among leftists, less so. 40% of rightists support annexation. This is still a minority. Even among the Israeli right wing, a minority support annexation, and another small percentage of the population support the status quo. So we can see here that the majority of Israelis support pragmatic solutions to the conflict. And even among Israelis that define themselves as right-wingers, they are not so right-wing as you might think. They, only a minority among them really support annexation of the West Bank. When we focus specifically on people who voted for Likud or for blue and white, for Kachol Lavan, what we see is that Likud voters, around 20% support a two-state solution, but 70% of blue and white voters support a two-state solution. That's an overwhelming majority. An additional 20% of them support separation, 25% of Likud voters. Only 36% of Likud voters support annexation. Again, what we see here is that even among Likud voters, and this is something that doesn't come as a surprise to us because we see this time and time again, we see that around 40 to 50% of Likud voters support pragmatic solutions to the conflict. When it comes to blue and white, we were somewhat surprised because there's really an overwhelming majority that support pragmatic solutions to the conflict. We also track change over time. You can see here the results of 5 surveys conducted since November 2018, looking at this question of support for policy outcomes. And you can see 2 major trends. The first trend is that support for a two-state agreement has somewhat dwindled over time, but not very dramatically, from 47 to 40%. And support for annexation has increased, especially since September 2019. The increase is significant. It's a 10% increase, but it's not surprising. September 2019 really marks the point when Netanyahu became less ambivalent about annexation and started promoting this policy. And it comes as no surprise that the Israeli public is following to some extent, but it's still not very dramatic. We still see a majority supporting a two-state solution. We also asked them, what would be your second choice? And here we see that an overwhelming, a large percentage of Israelis support separation as a second choice. The second largest group support the status quo. And again, annexation is not very popular, neither is the first choice or a second choice. But then we decided to see what happens when we add into the equation the new deal of the century, the Trump plan. And we also did another thing. We decided to separate the question on annexation into two different types of annexation: a partial annexation of the West Bank and a full annexation of the West Bank. So if we look at these two slices of the pie that have to do with annexation, we can see that together they amount to the same percentage of people that supported annexation without separating it into two different categories. But when we look at support for the two-state solution and separation, we can see that the Trump plan really takes a bite out of support for a two-state solution. And what this suggests is that most Israelis understand the Trump plan as a two-state solution. And this is something that we need to keep in mind. When we look at this again as a function of voting for blue and white or for Likud, we can see that when we add the Trump plan, then only 6% of Likud voters support the Trump plan. That's much less than support a two-state solution. Excuse me, that's much less than before. Another 19% support separation, and about a quarter support the Trump plan. When it comes to blue and white, then we can see again that majority support a two-state solution, another 20% separation, and a little more than a quarter support the Trump plan. So the Trump plan is really understood as a form of two-state solution. Then we asked questions about the perceived importance of the conflict with the Palestinians, and these are questions that we've been tracking over time. And here, if we look at a breakdown by political orientation, what we ask participants to do in this question is to rate the importance of each one of these issues. And we find, and this is something we find again and again in each survey, that security comes up first. Most Israelis are primarily concerned with security, and the Israeli right wing is more concerned with security than anybody else. And then we see all the other issues, and at the very end of the list comes the conflict with the Palestinians and Israel's identity as a Jewish state. And what is interesting about this is that although Israelis have an opinion about the conflict, they don't seem to rate the conflict or conflict-related issues as very important, aside from issues that pertain to their security. And when we ask more directly, how interested are you in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and how interested are you in the question of annexation, we can see that only 37% are interested in the conflict, and only a quarter of Israelis are interested in the question of annexation. And this is definitely something that we need to keep in mind and to work on to increase the perceived importance of these issues. We asked some specific questions about peace with Jordan. And when we asked Israelis to what extent is peace with Jordan important, an overwhelming majority think it's important. 80% think it's very important. An additional 16% think it's somewhat important. So there's no question that Israelis think that peace with Jordan is important. When we ask them, should Israel annex territories in the West Bank if annexation will harm relations with Jordan, what we see is that only a little more than a quarter think that yes, and the rest are divided between saying no and not being very sure. And I think that here, many Israelis lack the information to understand how annexation may harm relations with Jordan. When we break this down by political orientation, we can see that right-wing Israelis are more likely to say, yes, let's go on with annexation, in spite of the fact that it harms relations with Jordan. But the center and the left are very clearly opposed to anything that would harm relations with Jordan. And if you look at it by voting for Likud and blue and white, again, in the Likud, there are more people who say yes, but still it's only 41%, it's not a majority. And the vast majority of blue and white voters say no, we should not harm relations with Jordan. If I have a few minutes, I'll just go into COVID-19 and say that most Israelis think that Israel should help the Palestinians if a Palestinian city shows an outbreak of COVID-19, and this is primarily among the center and the left. And we also wanted to understand why Israelis want to help Palestinians. Is it because of a moral obligation, or is it because of their own self-protection? And we do see a sense of moral obligation among many Israelis, especially from the center and the left, but self-protection is higher. You can see that among right-wing Israelis, there's an increase of almost 20% in support for aid to the Palestinians if it has to do with their own self-protection. And that's fine, of course. It doesn't really matter what the motivation is, as long as there's understanding that this should happen. And finally, we asked questions about the current political stalemate and wanted to see what Israelis think should happen now. We see time and again that most Israelis support a national unity government, and this is what we find here as well. People on the right prefer a right-wing government, people on the left prefer a left-wing government, and what is clear is that nobody, almost nobody, supports fourth elections. So if we will take that direction, that will be against the will of most Israelis. Overall, what we can see is that in spite of everything, public support in Israel for the two-state solution and separation remain very high. There is a modest increase over the past 6 months in support for annexation, but it's modest in spite of the Netanyahu campaign, in spite of the Trump plan that calls for annexation of all settlements. So I think this really shows that if there is an increase, it is relatively moderate. The Trump plan, as I said before, is perceived as a two-state solution. Unfortunately, the conflict and the issue of annexation are not a major issue for the Israeli public, and this is something that we need to think about. Israeli support aid for the Palestinians, mostly for self-protective reasons, and we see in all of our surveys a consistent preference for a national unity government. So thank you.
Thank you, Gilad. Khalil.
I guess you've lost.
There you are. Great.
I'll say something about what is the nature of the debate today among Palestinians on how to respond to to a possible Israeli annexation, and what has been the impact of the discussion among the Palestinian public about this issue. But first, let me put this in a little bit of text in terms of how Palestinians define their today.
Khalil, you're frozen right now. I don't know what to do about that, but we can't hear you.
Is the single most important goal that we see among
Evan, we've lost Khalil. Why don't I ask Gilad a question while we're waiting for Khalil to come back, and then Gilad, if he comes back, we'll just stop talking and move back to Khalil. There actually been a number of questions.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah, we're good now. Okay, let's try again. Khalil, we don't hear you.
I'll try to switch platform.
Maybe turn off the video, that sometimes helps.
Yeah. If you want to stop the video and just, even though we would miss seeing your face, but we'd be able to hear you. Okay. Khalil, are you there? Do you hear us? Okay, well, while we're waiting for Khalil to join, and as I said, hopefully he will be able to get back on, and then we'll just continue with his presentation. In the meantime, Gilad, there have been a couple people are asking if you can explain the difference between separation and the two-state solution. When you poll people and ask these questions, how do you distinguish, if you do, and how do you understand the person being polled to understand? I see Khalil is coming back. Let's see if he's, Khalil, can you hear us? You're clearly experiencing, Khalil, we see you, but don't hear you. Khalil, are you muted? There you are. Okay. Can you hear me, Khalil?
Hello?
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Hi.
All right, let's start over here, and Gilad.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry for this. I hope we won't have a won't be disconnected again. I was saying that the basic goal remains a Palestinian state along the lines of 67 and East Jerusalem as capital, despite the fact that there has been significant erosion over the last decade in support for the concept of the two-state solution. Now, the main concern that we find among the Palestinian public regarding the status quo is that it is detrimental to helping the Palestinians achieve this goal, ending occupation and building a Palestinian state. The main threat seen today by the Palestinians is that annexation, particularly in the context of the Trump plan, essentially means killing the idea of a two-state solution altogether. So this is the context for the discussion in terms of how Palestinians should be responding to the threat of annexation. There are essentially four thoughts that we find among the elite and among the Palestinian public regarding the best course of action. The most drastic has been the one that the president himself has announced. This is his own intention. He has relations with Israel and Palestinian commitment to the Oslo Agreement and security coordination, obviously. This is something that has the largest level of support among the Palestinian public and within the institutions of the Palestinian Authority, as well as the institutions of the PLO. The second response that is preferred by about 2/3 of the Palestinian public is to respond to annexation and the Trump plan through violence. The support for violence hasn't dramatically increased over the last year or so, but as the means to stop annexation or the Trump plan, in fact, we do see a significant spike in favor of violence among the Palestinian public. This is obviously, this is not the position taken by the Palestinian, in particular, the political party of the president, remain strongly committed to avoiding any kind of violence. But we do find that among Fatah youth, there is in fact significant support for resort to violence as the means to stop the annexation. It is not meant in the eyes of the majority as an alternative to negotiations. And most Palestinians continue to believe that violence does not end occupation. So the rise in support for violence today is not meant to achieve that goal. The third response that we see, and this is the response that the Palestinian Authority itself rejects, just as it rejects the two-state, the violent response, and that is abandoning the two-state solution altogether and embracing a one-state outcome, a one-state solution. This demand is one that is particularly supported by young Palestinians. The younger, the more educated, the more likely they would prefer to see a one democratic state. In their view, annexation opens the door for that. And the Trump plan, along with an Israeli decision to annex, would indeed take the Palestinians there. Sooner or later, this would be the inevitable outcome of the process. Finally, the position that is advocated by a very small minority and among the Palestinian public, perhaps 10 to 15% of the Palestinians are in favor of this, is one that calls for re-engagement with the Trump administration, an offer to renew bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Among the elite, this is something that has recently been in part of the dialogue. The fact that a new Israeli government might be formed with Gantz and Ashkenazi playing central roles in the new government has led some Palestinians to believe not be too bad. Again, not the expectation is not that this would help renew the peace process, but rather it might help to freeze or avert any immediate move towards annexation. So basically, these are the four responses that we see both among the elite and among the Palestinian public. The most drastic, as I said, is the one that the president himself has advocated and has threatened to resort to. Let me now say something about the impact that we see, the impact of the discussion about annexation, the impact, particularly in the context of the Trump plan. We see four things in our surveys. Number one is indeed there is a shift in favor of a one-state solution. We've seen a rise, significant rise, a decline on the one hand is in support for the one-state solution. In fact, support for both the one-state solution and the two-state solution is almost equal today. And as I said earlier, among the youth, support for the one-state solution is much higher than the support for the one-state solution. The second thing that we see is a much more hawkish attitude among the Palestinian public. This is something that started to emerge soon after the Trump plan has been talked about. When the plan itself was released, we saw a significant majority of the Palestinians that have come to the conclusion that the Trump plan basically brings the conflict back to its origins, that is an existential conflict. We find that when people talk about existential conflicts, they basically become extremely hawkish. Their willingness to compromise goes down considerably. And this is clearly one of the outcomes that we see today. Thirdly, we do see an increase in support and an increased level of support for violence as the means to end the Israeli occupation. occupation. It's different from fighting against annexation or the Trump plan. This is more rational. Come to the conclusion that only violence would help end the occupation. We've been tracking this for the last 25 years at least. And during the last 15 years, for the most part, we never had a majority in favor of that kind of violence that is meant to essentially end the Israeli occupation. But in light of the discussion about annexation, we do significant rise, not a majority. We still do not have a majority in favor of violence as the means to end the Israeli occupation, but there is significant rise. Finally, we do see significant change in the domestic balance of power. Now, if we take Abbas as president of the Palestinian Authority and the head of Fatah, Ismail Haniyeh, again, we've been asking people about these two men and who among the two that people support. For the last 5 years, we have seen ups and downs, but in 2019, Abbas was actually doing well with the upper hand. Immediately after the release of the Trump plan, however, things shifted dramatically in favor of Haniyeh. So there is a change in the domestic balance of power that is, I can only attribute to the Trump plan and the belief that with the Trump plan, Abbas's way of doing things, Abbas's approach to ending occupation is essentially failed, and that this Hamas's approach, that is violence, is the way to go. And that leads to greater support for Hamas. Now, obviously, we don't know what the Palestinian Authority will do, but if it does go ahead with the most drastic measures it has promised or threatened to do, that is suspending or ending all agreements, ending security coordination, this will obviously have, I would say, dramatic, perhaps even catastrophic consequences for the PA and for Israeli-Palestinian relations. And a lot of these things that I've just said would dramatically change. For now, however, it does look very, very tense, and the pressure on Abbas to do what he says he wants to do is very high. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Khalil. People were asking if your feed was cut off. We know that wasn't true, but at the same time, there's obviously in Ramallah and in the West Bank an issue of connectivity, which hopefully will be addressed at some point in the future. So let me start with a couple of questions. We have a lot of questions from our audience, so I want to just start with a few of my own and then get to audience questions. Both of your findings seem to show a decline in support for the two-state solution among Israelis and Palestinians. Khalil, could you hone in on the impact of the Trump plan among Palestinians?
Well, it goes without saying that the Palestinians have always suspected that the Trump plan did not have a two-state solution in it. Now, the administration seems decided in the last minute to call whatever it has a two-state solution. During the last 2 years, we've been asking the public about the Trump plan, and we have seen significant level of opposition to it, demand that the Palestinian leadership rejects it, ranging between 2/3 to 3/4. When the plan was actually released, 94% rejected it, much higher than what we had seen before. When people didn't know what was in it, the opposition was not as, did not reach the consensus level that we have seen when it was eventually released. I believe that to a large extent, there are two reasons. There are, of course, a lot of details as to why people have rejected it. One has to do with the perception that it does not create a Palestinian state, that there is no Palestinian state at the end of the road. Worse yet, when we ask the Palestinians, what are the chances that the plan would actually end the Israeli occupation? Close to 70% said either 0 or less than 50%. Very few people thought, actually it was 2 or 3% who thought it was 100% that it would lead to the creation of a Palestinian state and to the ending of occupation. So the plan is, in fact, has been seen by the Palestinian public as one that buries the two-state solution, regardless of what the authors have declared about the intentions.
Okay, I think you froze again, Khalil. Gilad, could you speak a little bit more about the impact of the Trump plan on Israeli public opinion?
Yes, I'd like to begin by referring to your question to Khalil about a decline in support for the two-state solution in both populations. And I think we need to keep in mind that the two-state solution is still the most preferred solution among Israelis and among Palestinians against all odds. So even though there's a decline in support for it, even though among Israelis there's a slight increase in support for annexation, even though among Palestinians there's an increase in support for violence, we still, in spite of everything, in spite of the fact that there hasn't been a peace process, any kind of peace negotiations for over a decade, in spite of the fact that there's currently no leadership that is supporting the two-state solution, we're still seeing a large number of Israelis and Palestinians who support this plan. And I think that's quite remarkable. And to your question again, I'm sorry.
If you could talk a little bit more about the impact of the Trump plan on Israeli public opinion.
I think the Trump plan, to a large extent, is perceived in Israel as this present provided to us by Uncle Sam. And as such, it masks the prices that, the very severe price that is in the plan, the severe cost that is in the plan. So on the one hand, Israelis hear that the United States is supporting full annexation of all Israeli settlements, and that sounds like a positive thing. But the cost of that to Israel, in many respects, is the Israeli public is not aware of it, and this is something that we need to think about. But as my results show, overall, Israelis understand the Trump plan as a form of a two-state solution, while the Palestinians see it as basically the end of a two-state solution. Because the plan includes both a Palestinian state, whether or not realistic, it doesn't really matter, but it's perceived as a possibility of a Palestinian state, and annexation of the settlements, it sounds like a win-win situation. And I think that here we need to keep in mind that most people, in most places, don't know the details. So when Israelis hear about annexation of all of the settlements, the vast majority don't understand what that means. They don't know where these settlements are. They don't understand the implications of annexing all of these settlements.
Thank you. Gilad, I'm going to, and Khalil, I'm going to turn to audience questions. And Gilad, I asked you before, a number of people are wondering what is the difference between separation and the two-state solution? And how do you interpret their response to your recent poll?
The idea of separation is based on Commanders for Israel's Security plan of security first. And this comes out of the understanding that currently it's very difficult to advance the two-state solution. So instead of just waiting for that to happen, there is an ability to take some preliminary steps that would set the stage for a future two-state solution. And that includes closing the security fence, announcing publicly that Israel has no territorial demands east of the security fence, instating an evacuation compensation law, which would mean that settlers east of the fence would be able to receive compensation if they left their settlements. But the IDF would continue to be deployed in all of the territory. And what we find is that many Israelis like this idea, even Israelis on the right. Because for Israelis on the right, the main concern is the security concern. This is also something that is important to emphasize. Most rightists are not ideological rightists. They're not people who think that the entire land of Israel is important. They're people who are concerned that leaving the territories would be dangerous. So the idea of deploying the IDF, removing some settlements, and reducing friction between Israelis and Palestinians is appealing to Israelis on the left and the right.
Khalil, Gene Berger asks you to elaborate more on the generational aspects of support for violence as the means to end the occupation. You said that younger Palestinians favor violence more. How young? Do these younger respondents reach maturity only after, did they reach maturity only after the Second Intifada? And if so, does that factor have a bearing on their opinion?
Yes, indeed, of course. If you are younger, then you do not remember the agony and the suffering and the failures of resort to violence. And therefore, we do see much higher levels of support for violence among the youth. The younger you are, the more likely that you would support violence. So between 18 and 22 is the age group that we, in our surveys, find to be the one that is most likely to support violence. Those who are over 50 tend to be the least likely to support violence. So age seems to be the issue, and it's mostly having to do with memory and the youth simply knowing nothing but Oslo and negotiations and efforts to reach an agreement but failing and so on. And they therefore are likely to think that perhaps violence would work. Sometimes, of course, the examples of what happened in South Lebanon with Hezbollah and Hamas's example in Gaza and the belief that Israel pulled out from Gaza because of Hamas's violence, all of these issues occasionally play a role as well, and they seem to be more convincing to the youth.
I think this is probably for Gilad. Sam Fleischacker is curious about how many of the Israelis who do support full annexation also support giving voting rights to the Palestinians in the territories. Correlatively, I wonder whether supporters of annexation support permanently ruling over Palestinians without giving them voting rights. Gilad?
That's a very good question. And in one of our previous surveys, we gave participants various scenarios of annexation, which either include giving voting rights to Palestinians, not giving voting rights to Palestinians, etc. And what we find is that a small minority of Israelis support annexation with voting rights for Palestinians, and these are mostly far left Israelis. These are people who believe in a one-state solution, a one-state democratic solution along the lines of what Khalil described. Most Israelis who support annexation do not support giving rights, but when you talk to these people, they don't think of it as apartheid necessarily, because they have all kinds of excuses of how Israel will be able to somehow hold on to the territories and not provide rights without changing its character as a democratic state.
Khalil, Barbara Lando wants to know, if the annexation proceeds, what will be the impact on support for the current Palestinian leadership? Are there up-and-coming Palestinian leaders and Jewish leaders who could actually work together on real negotiations for two states?
It depends on what Abbas does. Abbas will be in an extremely difficult position. He has already promised ending all relations, including security coordination, terminating the commitments under Oslo. This would essentially destroy the Palestinian Authority, gradually leading to its gradual collapse and so on. But this is where the public is. If Abbas does not go this route, his standing among the Palestinian public will deteriorate significantly beyond where it is today, which is very, very low already. So he is in a very difficult spot. If he goes ahead, the risks are tremendous, and the consequences for these Palestinians will also be tremendous. And so I think, keep in mind that Abbas is a status quo man. He certainly does not like to rock the boat. This is not something that he would do easily, that is, to do what he threatens to do. He normally uses threats as ways to convince others to abort whatever they are trying to do. In most cases, when they call his bluff, he simply, he does nothing. So we don't know whether he will do it this time. If his threat is simply a bluff, he loses the public. If he goes ahead, the consequences for the entire PA and the Palestinian public will be extremely serious.
Gilad, we have a question from Inga Rog of the Swiss newspaper Neue Zürcher Zeitung. Do you expect the Prime Minister to go ahead with the annexation plan, given that the public is not supporting the idea?
It's very hard to answer that question because we know one thing: Netanyahu has been in power for over 10 years now, and he hasn't annexed even 1 inch of the West Bank. So it's very hard to tell whether what's going on right now is part of a ploy, a political strategy, or whether he really is planning to go ahead and annex the territories. There are good reasons to believe that, not only because of public opinion, but because of all kinds of other factors, such as Jordan, the European Union, etc. It will be difficult for him to carry out this plan. But I can say one thing: why public opinion is not going to matter too much for him, and that is because although most Israelis support pragmatic solutions, their level of support and their level of interest in these solutions is relatively low. And what I mean by that is that when we ask Israelis to choose what solution they prefer pragmatic solutions. But when we check how excited they are about these solutions, they're not very excited. On the other hand, when we look at the level of excitement for annexation, the minority that supports annexation is much more excited about annexation than the majority that does not support annexation. So in that sense, the people who are politically active, who do matter, who are also his constituency, are the ones who do support annexation.
Khalil, Stuart Sloan asks, what % of Palestinians support a right of return? Do supporters know that its implementation would lead to one state, Palestinian?
The overwhelming majority of the Palestinians support the principle of the right of return. This does not necessarily mean that they want Palestinian refugees to return to the state of Israel. In our surveys, we suggest a solution to the refugee question based on the Clinton parameters, but we add 100,000 returning to the state of Israel rather than 5 or 6 million. And we find a majority, a slight, slim majority, in favor of that. So there is clear distinction in the eyes of the Palestinians between the principle of the right of return and the language can be very flexible. We tested various types, including the ideas that were again proposed by the former President Clinton with regard to the language on the right of return. And we have found willingness among the Palestinian public to endorse these various types of language. So the right of return as a concept, as a principle, is very much important. And if any agreement denies the right of return, this is one thing that is different from not referring to it, denying it, as in the Clinton, as in the Trump plan, would be most devastating because it would immediately elicit significant rejection from the Palestinian public. However, if the language is flexible and allowing a symbolic number to return, this seems to satisfy the needs of the Palestinians on the refugee issue.
Here's a question for both of you from Sam Fleischacker. How well known among both Israelis and Palestinians is Eretz L'Kulam, 2 states, 1 homeland? Among those who know of it, how much support does it have?
We do not find many Palestinians who are aware of this. And we've asked questions in the past that are not identical to this, but similar. And ideas like a confederation, ideas like 2 separate states, but open borders, and so on. We do not find more support for this than there is for the 2-state solution. As I indicated, as Gilad indicated, for both Israelis and Palestinians, Israeli Jews and Palestinians, Israeli Arabs have been supporting, continue to support the 2-state solution by huge majorities. But for Israeli Jews and Palestinians, support for the 2-state solution remains higher than support for any other solution. And on top of that, if you offer both sides the right kind of incentives, in experiments that we've conducted jointly with colleagues at Tel Aviv University during the last 4 years, we have found that you can bring back support for the 2-state solution to, in fact, large majorities by satisfying certain needs of various Israeli and Palestinian constituencies. So the idea of a 2-state solution, perhaps on the Palestinian side, with some flexibility regarding borders and people's ability to travel freely, particularly for labor. Laborers, for example, we find that if the agreement allows for Palestinian laborers to continue to work in Israel, a 2-state solution that allows Palestinian laborers to continue to work in Israel, we find that this reduces the opposition to that solution significantly. So a level of interaction between the 2 sides. Now, on the Israeli Jewish side, obviously, this is not something that Israelis are open to as much as the Palestinians are. But you'll find that it helps on the Palestinian side to offer some sort of open borders, free movement, and so on.
Gilad, did you also want to?
Yes. Among Israelis, support for a 1-state solution, a 1-state democratic country is extremely low. Most Israelis define themselves as Zionists, and they are interested in a Jewish state. And such a solution is supported only by the very extreme left, the post-Zionist left.
Both Nancy Bernstein and Charles Kremer want to know, Gilad, if your research included Israeli Arabs, Israeli Palestinians, or was it confined to Israeli Jews? If you could enlighten us.
I should have clarified that. These surveys are only on Israeli Jews.
Okay. There's also a question for both of you about if there's any differential in response to your polling based on gender. Khalil, do you see any gender differences? And then Gilad.
Yes, we do see differences based on gender on some issues, not all issues. Palestinian women tend to be more religious than men, which means they are more conservative than men, which also means that they are more likely to support Hamas than men. However, when it comes to the peace process, we do not find significant differences between men and women with regard to the two-state solution. There's a decline in support. It's across the board, regardless of gender. However, when it comes to issues of violence, even those women who are religious and supportive of Hamas tend to be much less willing to support violence than men from the same category. So with the question of violence, we do see very clear distinction between men and women. Women support it much less, but when it comes to the domestic balance of power, women tend to side with Hamas.
Gilad, gender
Our
difference?
surveys, we don't find gender differences on these policy issues. Israeli men and women hold similar opinions. It's an interesting question because people have been looking for many years to find maybe that women are more supportive of peace or something like that, but we don't find that. Women on the right are just as rightist as men on the right, and the same goes for the left.
So Debbie Schlossberg posed the following. She says, it's difficult to square the idea of Israelis, quote unquote, not being aware of annexation, its implications and details. Israelis up till recently had the highest newspaper readership per capita in the world, and we know Israelis to be politically astute. So how is it that such a large percentage are considered to be so blind to these obvious facts? I guess that's for you, Gilad, primarily.
That's a very good question. You know, the fact is that in spite of the fact that Israelis are intelligent and learned and read newspapers, etc., when you ask them questions about the issues, when you want to see whether they understand the issues, whether they know the details, we see that they don't know the details very well and have many misconceptions about these issues. I didn't report all of the findings in the current survey, but one of the things that we did is we gave them kind of a quiz on the Trump plan to see whether they knew what the plan was about. And we gave them some false items and some true items. And we saw that many Israelis across the board made mistakes in understanding the Trump plan. So in spite of everything, most people don't know the facts. And when it comes to geography, you know, I'm afraid to ask whether Israelis know where the Jordan Valley is or where Ramallah is, etc. Many do not.
We're getting close to the end, but Julian Lederman asked a great question. What sense, this is for both of you, I think, what sense do you have for how people's views are tied to actual leadership? If Israelis believe the Palestinians had a leader that could effectively lead, and if Palestinians believe that Bibi had honest intentions. In other words, could we see 10% plus swings if each side had a Mandela? I'm going to ask you first, Khalil.
Most Palestinians distrust their own leadership and distrust the Israeli leadership. I'm afraid Palestinians view Netanyahu as a greater land of Israel person, a dogmatic person who is committed to right-wing ideology and politics. They do not view him as a pragmatic leader as many politicians and among the Palestinian elite think he is. The perception, however, is that if Abbas and Netanyahu do reach an agreement, there is a very good chance it would be implemented. So they distrust the intentions of the Israeli leadership, but if an agreement is reached, they do believe that Netanyahu is capable of bringing along the Israeli public.
Gilad?
Yeah, and I concur with Khalil, and we know from our research and our polls that Netanyahu has a large effect on public opinion, and if Netanyahu was to advance a two-state solution in agreement with the Palestinians, the Israeli public would go with that. People who vote for Likud or consider themselves right-wing are usually, as I said before, not ideologically committed to the right-wing ideology. They're much more committed to the party or the leader. And if the leader would go in that direction, in a two-state solution direction, the people would follow.
So we're at the top of the hour. I want to first of all mention that a number of people asked Gilad about being able to access your slides, your PowerPoint, and you can find it, anybody who's on this call, go to our website, israelpolicyforum.org, and you'll see the PowerPoint there. So Gilad, Toda, Khalil, Shukran. That's all the time we have today, but in closing, I want to take this opportunity once more, thank all of our supporters on this call. Our work depends on your generous backing, which is more critical than ever as we particularly face the imminent threat of West Bank annexation. If you enjoy our resources, the Koplo column, this video briefing every Tuesday, Israel Policy Pod, other resources, and you've not made a contribution, please especially consider doing so today on Giving Tuesday Now by going to israelpolicyforum.org/giving. And please stay tuned as we announce our upcoming speakers for this series on our Israel Policy Hub website, www.israelpolicyforum.org/hub. A recording of today's program will also be posted on the Israel Policy Hub website. I hope we'll see you again next Tuesday, May 5th, because if it's Tuesday, it's an IPF webinar. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yitraot. Thank you so much, Gilad and Khalil. Great to see both of you.
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.